April 23, 1945. Stalag VII-A, Moosburg, Bavaria. The gates opened at 1447. Friedrich Müller had imagined liberation 1,000 ways. Chaos, violence, revenge. He'd prepared himself for execution. A bullet to the back of the head seemed merciful compared to what German propaganda promised Americans did to prisoners. He'd rehearsed his final prayers, written his last letter home in his mind, over and over, words to a wife who might never know how he died. Instead, an American medic handed him water, not through, handed with eye contact. "Drink slowly," the medic said in broken German. "Your stomach needs time." Friedrich took the canteen with shaking fingers. The water was clean, cold. He wanted to gulp it down, but the medic's hand stayed his wrist. Gentle pressure, patient, slow. Around him, 3,000 German prisoners watched the same scene repeat. American soldiers moving through the compound, not with rifles raised, but with medical bags open, checking pulses, examining wounds, speaking in quiet voices. The contrast was so severe it felt like hallucination. Friedrich had been a physician before the war, before the Wehrmachtarzt, before Russia, before everything ended in the smoking ruins of Stuttgart, where American artillery had found his field hospital. He knew medicine. He knew anatomy. He thought he knew war. He knew nothing. The American camp commander, a major with iron gray hair and tired eyes, addressed them in the courtyard. His German was formal, textbook perfect. "You are prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention. You will be fed. Your wounded will receive medical care. You will be treated with the dignity accorded to soldiers." Soldiers, not criminals, not animals. Soldiers. A young SS officer near Friedrich spat blood and laughed bitterly. Lies. Propaganda. Wait until the Amis finish processing us. He'd believed the party line to the end. Americans were Jewish-controlled barbarians, culturally inferior, militarily primitive, Untermensch, who somehow kept winning through sheer numbers and cowardice. But that evening, Friedrich learned his first lesson in American abundance. Dinner arrived in trucks, not scraps, not thin soup, hot food on metal trays, potatoes, meat, actual meat, not the ersatz garbage they'd been eating since 1943. Bread, white bread, soft, fresh. Friedrich stared at his tray. This single meal contained more calories than he'd eaten in the past week. The portions were identical for every prisoner, no hierarchy, no favoritism, just food. Eat. The same medic from earlier stood nearby, watching them. "Tomorrow you get examined, full medical workup." Workup? Friedrich's English was decent. He'd studied in Vienna before the war, when English literature seemed important. Physical exam, blood work if needed, dental check. The medic rattled it off like a shopping list. Routine, dental check. Friedrich hadn't seen a dentist in 3 years. In Germany, dentistry was for officers, for party members, for those who mattered. He'd pulled his own infected molar with pliers and vodka in a frozen trench outside Kursk. The medic noticed his expression. Problem. No problem. Friedrich's voice came out rough. I did not expect. Expect what? Humanity. Efficiency. This casual assumption that even prisoners deserved functioning teeth. But Friedrich couldn't say that. Couldn't admit that every assumption he'd carried into captivity was crumbling like wet bread. "Nothing," he said finally. "Thank you for the food." That night, sleeping on a cot with a blanket, Friedrich couldn't sleep. Around him, 3,000 men breathed in the darkness. Some wept, some prayed, some simply stared at the ceiling, processing the same impossible reality. Tomorrow would bring the medical examination. Friedrich both dreaded and anticipated it, because he knew what they'd find. April 24, 1945, Camp Medical Facility, 0830. The hospital tent was a revelation. Friedrich had worked in field hospitals. He knew what wartime medicine looked like. Blood-soaked tables, screaming patients, surgeons working by lamplight with vodka-sterilized instruments, morphine rationed to the dying alone. He'd performed amputations with a hacksaw. He'd sutured wounds with ordinary thread. He'd watched gangrene consume men because they had no sulfa drugs, no penicillin, no time, no hope. This place was a cathedral by comparison. Electric lights, bright, steady, abundant, clean linoleum floors, the smell of disinfectant instead of rot, rows of beds with white sheets, actual white sheets, laundered and pressed, Medical equipment he'd only seen in textbooks. X-ray machines, electrocardiographs, sterilization units, shelves of supplies organized with military precision, and that shelf of penicillin. The American doctor assigned to process him was a captain named Jonathan Chen, Chinese-American, impossibly young, maybe 30, with steady hands and tired eyes. He wore the medical corps insignia, and his English carried a slight accent that Friedrich couldn't place. Friedrich Müller, Chen read from the form. Physician. Yes. Before the war. Friedrich stood in his undergarments, feeling exposed in more ways than physical. I am a doctor. Excellent. Your English is good. We'll need help with the German wounded. Our translators are overwhelmed. Chen gestured to the examination table. Let's see what we're working with. The exam was thorough, methodical. Chen checked his heart, lungs, reflexes, palpated his abdomen, examined the poorly healed shrapnel scar on his shoulder, a Russian gift from the Kursk salient, looked at his teeth, and winced. 3 infected molars, 2 cracked, severe gingivitis. Chen made notes. We'll schedule you with dentistry next week. They'll need to extract these 2, probably root canal on this one. Root canal, Friedrich repeated. You will, for a prisoner. Chen looked up. His expression was mild, puzzled. You're in pain, aren't you? Yes, but... Then we treat it. Chen said it as if explaining basic arithmetic. You're a doctor. You understand infected teeth can lead to endocarditis, sepsis. We're not going to let you develop a systemic infection because of dental problems. In Germany... Friedrich stopped. In Germany, prisoners got bullets. Sometimes. If they were lucky. This seems excessive. Excessive. Chen's eyebrow raised. It's standard care. Open your mouth again. Friedrich complied. Chen probed with a dental mirror, muttering to himself. Then he turned to the supply cabinet, and retrieved a small bottle. Penicillin suspension, Chen said. Rinse with this twice daily until we can get you into surgery. It'll reduce the infection, make the extraction cleaner. He handed Friedrich the bottle casually, the way you'd hand someone aspirin. Friedrich held it like a religious artifact. This small glass bottle, 60 milliliters maybe, represented more medical resources than his entire field hospital had possessed in 6 months. In Russia, men died of sepsis from infected teeth. Here, prisoners got penicillin mouthwash. Something wrong? Chen asked. No, Friedrich searched for words. In Germany, we did not have this medicine. I watched many men die who would have lived with penicillin. Chen's expression shifted. Something passed behind his eyes. Not pity exactly. Recognition, maybe. Sorrow. I'm sorry, he said quietly. That must have been hard. The apology stunned Friedrich more than the medicine. An American officer apologizing to a German prisoner for German shortages. The absurdity was so complete, it felt like satire. Use the rinse, Chen continued, and stop by the dental tent Friday morning. They'll take x-rays, plan the extraction. X-rays for dental work, for prisoners. Friedrich left the examination room in a daze. In the waiting area, other German prisoners sat on clean benches, holding numbers, waiting their turn. Orderly, civilized. A young soldier, barely 18, clutched his bandaged arm and tried not to cry. An American nurse noticed and brought him water and crackers. For the pain, she said gently in German. Her accent was atrocious, but her meaning clear. The boy took the crackers with shaking hands. Danke, he whispered. Rest, she said. Doctor will see you soon. Friedrich watched this exchange with a strange pressure building in his chest. This boy, this child soldier, had probably believed every word of Goebbels's propaganda, had probably imagined Americans as movie monsters, cartoon villains. Now a woman with kind eyes was bringing him crackers because pain made people human, regardless of uniform. The cognitive dissonance was physically painful. If this fact surprised you as much as it surprised him, hit that like button to show that more of these forgotten stories need to be told. Now back to the story. April 26, 1945. Surgical ward, 14 hours. The scream cut through the afternoon, quiet. Friedrich looked up from the medical textbook Chen had lent him. An English-language anatomy text, 3 years old but still more current than anything in Germany. The scream came again, raw and animal. German words, a young voice. He found Chen already moving toward the surgical tent, medical bag in hand. Friedrich followed without thinking. Inside, 2 medics restrained a 19-year-old Panzer Grenadier on a table. His name was Klaus Weber. Friedrich learned this later. Now he was just a screaming boy with catastrophic abdominal wounds, shrapnel from an American 105mm shell that had turned his intestines into hamburger. "Hold him," Chen snapped. "Morphine 5 milligrams, plasma 2 units, stat." The American team moved like clockwork. No hesitation, no discussion. The IV went in smoothly despite Klaus's thrashing. Morphine followed. The screaming subsided to whimpers. Chen was already scrubbing. "Friedrich, you're a physician, yes." "Yes, but I—" "Scrub in. I need hands." "I am a prisoner." "You're a doctor. Scrub. Now." Friedrich found himself at the wash station, hands moving automatically through the familiar ritual. Soap, water, brush. The motions unchanged since medical school, before everything broke. Beside him, an American corpsman worked in silence, methodical and calm. By the time Friedrich entered the surgical theater, Klaus was under full anesthesia. Chen had already opened the abdomen. The damage was catastrophic. Perforated bowel in 3 places, ruptured spleen, bleeding that wouldn't stop. In a German field hospital, this boy would have received morphine and prayers. Death in 12 hours, maybe 24 if he was unlucky. "Retractor," Chen said. Friedrich took it, held, watched as Chen worked with impossible precision. Every movement economical, purposeful. The American surgeon cut away destroyed tissue, clamped bleeders, sutured perforations. An hour passed, then 2. The surgical team rotated positions, but Chen never stopped. His hands never wavered. "Plasma count?" Chen asked. 6 units, a nurse replied. 8 available. 6 units for a German prisoner. Friedrich had seen Wehrmacht soldiers die for lack of a single unit. This boy was receiving enough blood products to supply a small field hospital. "Start Unit 7, Chen said. "And get me more suture. I need to reconstruct this section." Another hour. Friedrich's arms ached from holding the retractor, but he didn't move, couldn't look away. This was surgery as art, as obsessive perfectionism. Chen wasn't just saving a life. He was rebuilding a human being from pieces, refusing to accept that anything less than complete recovery was acceptable. Finally, impossibly, Chen stepped back. "Close him up. 70 units of penicillin intramuscular every 4 hours for the next week. Watch for peritonitis. If his fever spikes above 102, call me immediately. 70 units every 4 hours, 4 a week." Friedrich did the math automatically. That was 4,760 units total for one patient. In Germany, that amount of penicillin could supply an entire hospital for a month. Here, it was the routine post-operative protocol for a single enemy soldier. As they stripped off their surgical gloves, Friedrich finally found his voice. "Why?" Chen looked at him surprised. "Why what?" "Why this?" Friedrich gestured at the tent, the equipment, the sleeping boy with his abdomen neatly sutured. "He is German. Enemy. He was trying to kill you last week. Why? Why this effort?" Chen dried his hands slowly. Around them, the surgical team cleaned instruments, prepared for the next case. Normal afternoon in an American field hospital. Routine. "He's 19, Chen said finally. "Probably drafted. Probably didn't want to be in that tank any more than I wanted to shoot at it. Now he's wounded. And he's a patient." "A patient?" Friedrich repeated. "Yes. Not an enemy." Chen met his eyes. "Once he's on my table. No. He's just a kid who needs surgery." He paused. "You're a doctor. You understand. The Hippocratic Oath doesn't have an asterisk that says, 'except in wartime.'" It was the most American thing Friedrich had ever heard. Naive, idealistic, completely impractical. And it had just saved Klaus Weber's life. Chen started to leave, then turned back. "You did good work today. Clean hands, steady grip. We could use you here if you're willing. Voluntary, I'm not ordering anything, but the wounded keep coming, German and American both, and we need doctors." Friedrich stared at him. "You would trust me? I am German." "You're a physician," Chen corrected. "That's what matters. Think about it. Let me know tomorrow." He left. Friedrich stood in the empty surgical theater, surrounded by the detritus of salvation. Blood-soaked gauze, empty plasma bottles, used syringes. The evidence of a medical system so abundant it could afford to treat enemy soldiers as if they were beloved sons. Klaus Weber's chest rose and fell steadily. Alive, against all odds, against all battlefield logic, simply alive. Friedrich walked back to the prisoner compound in silence. That night, he volunteered. May 3rd, 1945. Camp Hospital, 2230. The emergency cases came at night. Friedrich had been working with the American medical team for a week. Every day brought new absurdities, new impossibilities. A German sergeant with a crushed foot received a 4-hour surgery to save his toes, because the American orthopedic surgeon believed in preserving function whenever possible. An SS officer with severe burns received skin grafts. A teenager with shattered teeth got gold fillings. Gold. It's the standard, the dentist explained when Friedrich stared. Gold lasts longer than amalgam. Why would we use inferior materials? Because he's a prisoner, because it's expensive, because in Germany, gold fillings were for high-ranking officers only, because nothing about this medical system made any sense within the framework of total war. But Friedrich had stopped arguing, stopped trying to reconcile American medical practice with everything he knew about warfare. Instead, he simply worked, sutured wounds, administered medications, held retractors while Chen performed miracles. Tonight's case arrived by ambulance at 2230. German Feldwebel, 34 years old, crushed leg from a building collapse. The limb was a disaster. Compound fracture of the femur, tibia shattered in 3 places, severed artery poorly clamped by field medics, gangrenous tissue already spreading. The smell hit Friedrich before he saw the wound. Amputation case. The triage nurse said flatly, "Get him prepped." Chen arrived, examined the leg, and frowned. "Maybe not." "Sir," the nurse's skepticism was audible. "That leg is gone. Smell alone tells you that. Get me x-rays first and call orthopedics. Tell them I need a consult." "Captain, it's almost 11. "Wake them up." The x-rays came back grim. The nurse was right. By any conventional standard, this leg required amputation. The fractures were too severe, the tissue death too advanced. Clean amputation, aggressive antibiotics, hope for the best. Standard battlefield medicine. But Chen kept staring at the x-rays, expression unreadable. The orthopedic surgeon arrived 20 minutes later, still pulling on his uniform shirt. Major Patterson, a tall man from Tennessee with enormous hands and a permanent squint. He looked at the x-rays, then the patient, then back at the x-rays. "You're joking," he said to Chen. "Can you save it?" "Can I?" Patterson laughed without humor. "Yeah, probably. Should I spend 6 hours in surgery, use 50 units of blood products, burn through enough penicillin to supply a battalion, all to save the leg of an enemy soldier who might die of sepsis anyway?" He paused. "Is that what you're asking me?" "Yes," Chen said simply. Patterson looked at Friedrich. "You're German. What would your doctors do?" Friedrich had watched this exact scenario play out a dozen times in Russia. The answer was brutally simple. Cut the leg. Morphine for pain. Hope he survives the infection. Logical, Patterson said. Efficient. Conserves resources. He turned back to Chen. "So, why shouldn't we?" "Because we can do better." The words hung in the air. Around them, the camp hospital hummed with activity. Nurses checking vitals, medics restocking supplies, generators powering lights that never flickered. The machinery of American medical abundance, operating at midnight, debating whether to spend a fortune on a single German leg. Patterson sighed. "You're going to make me do the right thing, aren't you?" "I'm suggesting we try." "Fine, get him prepped. Full anesthesia. I want vascular on standby, fresh plasma, and every unit of penicillin we can spare. This is going to take all night." It took 6 hours. Friedrich assisted, third pair of hands, watching 2 American surgeons fight for a German leg with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. Patterson reconstructed the shattered bones with steel pins and wire. The vascular surgeon restored blood flow with grafts harvested from the patient's good leg. Chen managed the infection, cutting away dead tissue with meticulous care, irrigating with enough saline to fill a bathtub. And the penicillin. So much penicillin. "Another dose," Patterson called, "and keep it coming post-op. This guy's getting the full protocol." "That's 70 units every 3 hours," the nurse calculated, "for potentially weeks. Then it's 70 units every 3 hours for weeks." Patterson didn't look up from his work. "Log it. Command can complain later." At Soto 4:30, they finally closed. The leg was saved, barely, pale, swollen, but perfused, with blood flow, with sensation, with a chance Friedrich stripped off his surgical gown in the pre-dawn darkness, exhausted to his bones. Chen found him sitting on the steps outside the surgical tent, watching the sun rise over Bavaria. "You're wondering why," Chen said. It wasn't a question. Friedrich nodded. "So am I, honestly." Chen sat beside him. "From a pure resource standpoint, Patterson's right. That surgery consumed enough supplies to treat 20 men. Maybe 30. If we were being logical, we'd have amputated, moved on, accepted the loss. But you did not." "No." "Why?" Chen was quiet for a long moment. "Because once you start calculating which lives are worth saving and which aren't, you stop being a doctor. You become an accountant with a scalpel." He paused. "That path ends in places I don't want to go." Friedrich understood. He'd been to those places, seen what happened when medicine became mathematics, when some lives counted more than others. The slippery slope from pragmatism to atrocity was shorter than anyone wanted to admit. "In Germany," Friedrich said slowly, "we believed we were the superior civilization, advanced, cultured, scientific. We believed Americans were less than us, materialistic, soft, racially inferior." The words tasted like ash. "But you have penicillin in abundance. You do 6-hour surgeries on prisoner legs. You give gold fillings to enemy soldiers. And we—" He stopped. "We have nothing. We are nothing. Everything we believed was a lie." Chen looked at him with something like compassion. "It was a lie, yes, but you don't have to keep believing it." "How do I stop, when every day here proves that everything I thought I knew was false?" "One day at a time, one patient at a time." Chen stood, stretched. "We've got morning rounds in 3 hours. Get some sleep." He left. Friedrich sat alone, watching the sun climb over a Germany that no longer existed. Somewhere behind him, a German soldier slept with both legs intact because American doctors had decided his wholeness mattered more than efficiency. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. But slowly, day by day, it was being replaced by something else, something tentative and painful and strangely like hope. May 8, 1945, Camp Hospital 11. The announcement came over the loudspeaker. Germany had surrendered, unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Friedrich was changing dressings on a young German soldier, 18 years old, bilateral hand wounds from a grenade he'd held too long. They'd saved his fingers through microsurgery so delicate Friedrich could barely believe he'd witnessed it. Another American miracle, another impossibility made routine. The soldier heard the announcement and began to cry, silently, tears streaming down his face as he stared at his bandaged hands. "We lost," he whispered. "It's really over. We lost." Friedrich had no comfort to offer. What could he say? They had lost. Catastrophically. Completely. Everything they'd fought for, bled for, died for, all of it rendered meaningless by a piece of paper signed in a schoolhouse in France. But they'd also survived, against odds, against expectation, against the propaganda that promised American cruelty. They'd survived into a world where gold fillings and penicillin and 6-hour leg surgeries were given to defeated enemies as if they were rights, not privileges. That evening, Chen gathered the German medical volunteers. There were 6 now, all physicians or medics who'd chosen to keep working. They met in a small office attached to the surgical ward. Chen closed the door. "I want to show you something," he said quietly. "But I need to warn you, it's not easy to see." He placed a folder on the desk. Black and white photographs spilled out. At first, Friedrich couldn't process what he was seeing. Piles of something. Stacks. Mountains. Then his brain caught up with his eyes. Bodies. Human bodies. Thousands of them. Skeletal, naked, stacked like cordwood. And the living, if you could call them that, walking skeletons with empty eyes, ribs countable from across a room, faces that weren't quite human anymore. "Dachau," Chen said softly. "We liberated it 10 days ago. Buchenwald before that. Mauthausen. The reports keep coming in. There are dozens of these camps. Maybe more." Friedrich stared at the photographs. His hands had gone numb. The room seemed to tilt. "This is what you were fighting for," Chen continued. His voice held no anger, just a terrible, exhausted sadness. "Maybe you didn't know. Maybe you convinced yourself it was propaganda, lies, enemy fiction, but this is real. This is what your government did, in your name. While your doctors were rationing morphine and dying of supply shortages, resources were going here, to this. One photograph showed a room full of eyeglasses, just eyeglasses, thousands of them, mountains of wire frames and glass, each one representing a face, a person, a life snuffed out with industrial efficiency. Another photo showed the ovens. Friedrich's stomach heaved. He barely made it to the trash can before vomiting, heaved until nothing came up but bile and horror. Behind him, the other German doctors stood in stunned silence. One was crying. Another had gone completely white, swaying on his feet. Chen waited, patient, implacable. When Friedrich could finally speak, his voice came out broken. "I didn't know. We didn't." But that was a lie too, wasn't it? They'd all known something. Rumors, whispers, things no one talked about because talking made you complicit, made you next. They'd all chosen not to look too close, not to ask too many questions. "This is why we do what we do," Chen said quietly. "Why we spend 6 hours saving legs, why we use gold fillings, why we treat you like patients instead of enemies." He gathered the photographs, put them back in the folder, because the moment we start seeing people as less than human, the moment we decide some lives matter less than others, we end up here, at this. The silence in the room was absolute. "You wanted to know why American medicine treats everyone," Chen continued. "This is why. Because the alternative, the world where we calculate worth, where we ration humanity, where we divide people into categories of deserving and undeserving, that world creates this." He tapped the folder. "And we won't go there, ever, no matter the cost." Friedrich understood then, finally, completely. The American abundance wasn't naivete. It wasn't idealism. It was a choice, a deliberate, expensive, difficult choice to reject the efficiency of cruelty in favor of the inefficiency of compassion. To spend 6 hours on a single leg because the alternative was to start asking which legs were worth saving. And that question led, inevitably, to rooms full of eyeglasses. "Can you continue working?" Chen asked. After seeing this, could he? Friedrich looked at his hands, hands that had sutured German and American wounds with equal care these past weeks, hands that had held retractors while Chen rebuilt bodies, hands that had been complicit through silence and acceptance in the system that created those photographs. "Yes," he said finally, "I will work. Because..." His voice cracked. "Because it is the only atonement I can make, the only way to be more than what we were." Chen nodded. "Then we keep going. Tomorrow morning, rounds at 600. June 15th, 1945, Camp Hospital 16s. 6 weeks after liberation. 6 weeks of working alongside the enemy who'd proven to be more human than friends. 6 weeks of watching impossible things become routine. Friedrich had become indispensable to the American medical team. His German language skills made patient interviews efficient. His surgical training, though dated, was solid. Chen trusted him to run the evening shift alone, overseeing the German medical staff, handling routine cases. Today's case wasn't routine. Klaus Weber, the 19-year-old from the emergency surgery, had recovered. Against astronomical odds, he'd survived the abdominal reconstruction with no complications. The infection that should have killed him never materialized, drowned in waves of penicillin. His wounds had healed cleanly. He'd gained back 15 pounds. Now he sat in Friedrich's office, healthy and confused and angry. "They want to send me to a work camp in France," Klaus said, "for reconstruction labor, but my papers say I'm fit for duty again." "Fit," he laughed bitterly. "The Americans saved my life so I could dig ditches." Friedrich looked at the file. Klaus Weber, 19, drafted at 17. 3 months of combat before the shell that should have killed him. No party membership, no war crimes on record. Just a kid who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, in the wrong uniform, in the wrong century. "You are lucky to be alive," Friedrich said quietly. "Many were not so fortunate." "Lucky." Klaus's voice rose. "I'm a prisoner. I'll spend years in a camp. My mother thinks I'm dead. My girlfriend." He stopped. "What kind of luck is this?" Friedrich had no answer. Because Klaus was right. He would spend years in French labor camps, would dig foundations and clear rubble and rebuild the cities his country had destroyed, would be treated as a perpetual enemy by people who had every reason to hate him, would carry the weight of German guilt for crimes he'd never committed but couldn't escape. And yet, "You have both legs," Friedrich said finally. "Intact legs. Full function. Do you understand how rare that is? How much effort went into keeping you whole?" The Americans spent 6 hours in surgery saving you, used enough medicine to supply a battalion, treated you as if you were their brother. Friedrich leaned forward. "Do you know what German doctors would have done with your wounds?" Klaus looked away. "Amputated." "Yes. Cut the leg, managed the pain, hoped you survived. That is battlefield medicine, efficient, logical. You would have lived, probably, but as an amputee." Friedrich paused. "Here, you are whole. You can walk, run, dance with your girlfriend when you finally go home, because American doctors decided your wholeness mattered more than efficiency." Silence. "The world you knew is gone," Friedrich continued. "Germany is gone. The 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years and died in a bunker. Everything we believed about superiority, about destiny, about who we were, all lies, all horror." He thought of the photographs Chen had shown him. "But you survived into a different world, a world where even enemies are treated as humans, where medicine doesn't calculate worth, where you kept both legs because some American surgeon decided you deserved them." Klaus met his eyes. "What do I do with that?" "Live," Friedrich said simply. "Live well. Live honorably. Build something better than what we destroyed. That is how you repay the debt." After Klaus left, Friedrich sat alone in the office. Through the window, he could see the hospital yard, American medics playing baseball during their break, German orderlies washing ambulances, the easy integration of former enemies into the routine of healing. 6 weeks ago, this scene would have been unthinkable. Now it was Tuesday. Chen appeared in the doorway. Busy. The usual. Friedrich gestured at the stack of patient files. 23 today. Mostly routine. 1 abscess drainage. 1 possible appendicitis. I sent him to you. Saw him. Definitely appy. Surgery tomorrow. Chen dropped into the other chair. "You're good at this, you know. Patient care. The Germans trust you." "They are my countrymen." "Still, you could have refused to help, stayed bitter, held on to the old beliefs." Chen shrugged. "Some of the other prisoners do. We have a whole tent of SS officers who refuse treatment because they'd rather die than accept help from racial inferiors." Friedrich had heard about that tent. The true believers. The ones who still thought they'd won. Somehow. Or would win, eventually. Or at least hadn't really lost. The ones who looked at penicillin bottles and saw proof of Jewish conspiracy rather than the simpler truth. They'd been wrong. About everything. "I cannot be what I was," Friedrich said slowly. "After what I have seen here, after what I have learned, I cannot go back to believing those lies." "What will you do after you're released?" "I do not know. Return to medicine, perhaps, if they allow it. If I can live with myself." He paused. "I think about those photographs you showed me, about what we did, what I was part of, even through ignorance. How do I practice medicine? How do I take an oath to do no harm when I was complicit in that harm?" Chen was quiet for a long moment. "You do better. You learn from it. You spend the rest of your life treating patients as if their humanity isn't negotiable because you've seen what happens when it is." He stood. "That's all any of us can do. Be better than we were yesterday." Simple American optimism. The naive belief that people could change, that redemption was possible, that the future didn't have to be determined by the past. Friedrich wanted to believe it. Some days, working beside Chen, watching American abundance turn death sentences into discharge papers, he almost did. July 20th, 1945, final day. The transfer orders came on a Thursday. Friedrich Müller and 200 other German medical personnel were being moved to a processing center in France. From there, eventual repatriation, home, whatever that meant now, in a Germany divided among victors, its cities in ruins, its people scattered. Chen found him packing his few possessions, the anatomy textbook, a gift, a spare uniform, letters from his wife that had finally reached him through Red Cross channels. She was alive. Their apartment in Stuttgart was gone. She was living with her sister in Hamburg, waiting. "So, this is it," Chen said. "Yes." Friedrich folded the uniform carefully. "I wanted to thank you. For everything. For—" His English failed him. "How did you thank someone for destroying your worldview? For showing you that everything you believed was a lie, but doing it with such kindness that you couldn't maintain the comfort of hatred. You don't have to thank me. You did good work here. I learned much from watching us waste resources on enemy soldiers." Chen's tone was light, but his eyes were serious. "From watching you treat them as humans, as patients, as if their worth was not negotiable." Friedrich met his gaze. "That is not waste. That is, I do not have the English word. Civilization, perhaps. Humanity. The thing we lost, and you showed us again." Chen pulled something from his pocket. A small glass vial, penicillin, the familiar label, the milligram dosage, the manufacturing stamp from some American pharmaceutical plant, operating at impossible scale. "Keep this," Chen said. "Reminder." Friedrich stared at the vial. "Why?" "Because you're going back to a Germany that has nothing. No food, no medicine, no infrastructure. People are going to need doctors, and those doctors are going to face impossible choices about who to treat and who to let die." Chen pressed the vial into Friedrich's hand. "When you're making those choices, remember that there's another way. Remember that abundance is possible, that treating everyone isn't naive idealism. It's a choice that requires resources, yes, but also requires the will to see every patient as worth saving. One vial will not change Germany. No. But maybe one doctor will." Chen smiled slightly. "You've seen what American medicine looks like. What happens when a system decides that human life, all human life, has value? Take that knowledge home. Teach it. Build it. Germany's going to rise again eventually. Make sure it rises better." Friedrich closed his fingers around the vial. Such a small thing. 60 milliliters of amber liquid. In Russia, men had died for lack of this. Here it was given as a parting gift to a former enemy. "I will try," he said. "I do not know if I will succeed. Germany is broken. The guilt alone." "Then fix it, one patient at a time. That's all any of us can do." They shook hands. Western custom. Firm grip. Eye contact. The physical acknowledgement of equals. 6 months ago, Friedrich would have refused such contact with an inferior. Now, he recognized it for what it was. Basic human respect, extended regardless of uniform or nationality or past crimes. The bus left at 14:00. Friedrich took a window seat, watched the camp hospital recede. Somewhere in those tents, Klaus Weber was probably changing dressings, learning to be a medic from American instructors. Others were receiving their final treatments, preparing for the long journey home. All alive, all intact, all witnesses to an impossible kindness. The vial of penicillin sat heavy in Friedrich's pocket. He would keep it unopened, a talisman, a reminder, a small glass bottle containing not just medicine, but a philosophy, that every life was worth the 6-hour surgery, the gold filling, the 70 units every 4 hours for weeks. He would return to Germany, to rubble and starvation and guilt so heavy it would take generations to lift. He would practice medicine in the ruins, making impossible choices with insufficient resources, but he would remember, would carry forward the lesson that American medics had taught him, not through propaganda or speeches, but through the simple act of treating enemies as if their humanity wasn't negotiable. That was their victory, not the tanks or bombs or superior firepower. Their victory was measured in saved legs and prevented infections, in enemy soldiers who walked away whole. That was the war they'd won long before the shooting stopped. Epilogue. Dr. Friedrich Müller returned to Germany in September 1945. He spent the next 30 years practicing medicine in Hamburg, advocating for universal health care, and teaching medical students that the worth of a patient couldn't be calculated by nationality, class, or circumstance. He kept the vial of penicillin on his desk until his death in 1976, though he never opened it. When asked about his experience in American captivity, he always said the same thing. "They saved my life by destroying my world. I hated them for it. Then I thanked them." Klaus Weber survived the labor camps and returned to Germany in 1948. He became a nurse, working in the same Hamburg hospital as Friedrich. He walked without a limp, danced at his wedding, raised 3 children. He never forgot that American doctors had fought for 6 hours to save his leg when the logical choice would have been amputation. Captain Jonathan Chen continued practicing military medicine until 1968. He treated American soldiers in Korea, Vietnam, and various bases around the world. When asked why he'd spent so much effort on German prisoners, his answer never changed: because they were patients. That's all that mattered. The medical protocols developed in American prisoner camps during WW2s, the emphasis on treating all wounded equally, the aggressive use of antibiotics, the commitment to saving function rather than just saving lives, became the foundation of modern battlefield medicine. The idea that enemy soldiers deserved the same standard of care as your own troops seemed radical in 1945. By 1970, it was doctrine. The vial of penicillin sits today in a medical museum in Hamburg, unopened, still sealed, a small glass bottle that contains not just medicine, but memory. The memory of a moment when American medics made a choice to see humanity in their enemies, to treat wounds without asking whose side the wounded had fought for, to prove that abundance, medical, moral, philosophical, was possible even in war's worst moments. They saved both their own and their enemies. In doing so, they saved something else, something harder to quantify, but impossible to forget. They saved the possibility that humans could still be human, even when everything suggested otherwise. That was their gift, and it cost more than penicillin, more than surgery time, more than 6-hour operations on impossible cases. It cost them nothing less than their willingness to see enemies as patients, to treat worth as intrinsic rather than earned, to believe that the boy on the table, whether American or German, Allied or Axis, deserved both legs, gold fillings, and the full weight of medical science fighting for his survival. The Germans had expected cruelty. They'd been trained to expect it, promised it, prepared for it. Instead, they got something far more devastating: kindness. Professional, efficient, abundance-backed kindness that made every excuse, every justification, every piece of propaganda crumble into ash. You can't unsee humanity in your enemy's eyes. Once you've been treated as if your life matters, really matters, worth 6 hours and 6 units of blood products and 70 doses of penicillin, you can't go back to believing that some lives count less than others. That was the Americans' true weapon, not the tanks or planes or endless industrial production. Their weapon was the simple, radical insistence that even enemies were human. That medicine didn't negotiate, that the oath to do no harm meant everyone, always, regardless. The Third Reich had promised 1,000 years. It delivered 12, then collapsed into mass graves and rooms full of eyeglasses. The American medics promised nothing except what medical ethics demanded. But their legacy endured. In every hospital that treats patients equally, in every doctor who fights for hours to save a life that efficiency would write off, in every medical system that refuses to calculate human worth, in every moment when someone chooses compassion over convenience, humanity over mathematics. The war ended in 1945. But the battle those medics fought, the battle to preserve human dignity, even in war's dehumanizing chaos, that battle continues in every examination room, every surgical theater, every moment when someone has to choose between the easy math of triage and the harder math of morality. Friedrich kept his penicillin vial as a reminder. Klaus kept both legs. Chen kept working. And the lesson they learned together, that humanity isn't a resource to be rationed, but a reality to be recognized, outlived them all. The Germans had been shocked, devastated, their entire worldview shattered by the simple act of enemy medics who refused to see enemies, only patients. That shock reverberated through decades, through generations. Through every German doctor who learned medicine in the post-war years and heard the stories of American prisoner camps where gold fillings and penicillin and 6-hour surgeries were given to defeated soldiers as if their wholeness mattered, because it did matter. That was the lesson. That was the gift. That was the victory that no propaganda could undo, no revision could rewrite, no time could erase. They saved both their own and their enemies. And in the process, they saved the idea that saving everyone was possible. Difficult, expensive, requiring endless resources and unwavering commitment, but possible. That small glass vial sits in Hamburg, unopened, unchanged, eternal. A reminder that once upon a time, in the worst war humanity had ever fought, some people chose to be human anyway, and that choice made all the difference.